Thank you for logging into the second installment of this week's lecture when we deal with congregational context in general. I want to bring a couple of resources to mind to help frame this next portion. I want to give you a piece of history, a oldie but goodie here, little Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities, and then we'll dive in from there. This might sound familiar to some and new for others, but it always touches me every time I get to it. Dickens says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of the noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only." My man Charles Dickens. What I appreciate about Dickens is that he took context seriously. And by taking context seriously, it unlocked his genius. And I think oftentimes by not taking our contextual responsibilities, obligations, and observations seriously, we stifle our own genius. And so because he was transmitting what he was seeing into a form that people could receive, he was then able to speak the common tongue. He was able to relay the structures and the stresses of everyday people in such a way that people found redemption even in those things. So for me, Dickens helps to bring a context to our contextual discussion, because to not understand how to frame the times can make us irrelevant when speaking about the times. So if I'm not quite sure of how to make sense of the macro world, I can always be a step or two off when it comes to my analysis of the inner workings. So it's important to understand that paying attention to the structures, the systems, those who are feigned to be in power, those who are in power, what does power look like? These are questions that have to be teased out by the preacher. And those questions have to be teased out because they alert us to the particularity of context. Oftentimes, by ignoring these opportunities to grow, we miss tremendous places for us to foment change. A book I read when I was in seminary, I guess this is Yale Day. So a book that I read in seminary that touched me was Mill Hands and Preachers by Liston Pope. That book changed my life, because what Liston Pope does, he's a native of Thomasville, North Carolina. And what he does with his research is that he studies in many ways how context influences religious practice. And what he does in this particular book, Mill Hands and Preachers, is he does a sociological survey of a town in North Carolina outside of Concord that was essentially built by the industry of mills. And by doing an assessment, he realized that because of the economic weight of the factories and the mills had direct impact upon the ways in which people were economically rewarded and how preachers preached. And so the direct correlation between political, social, economic power and the ways that it landed in the sermon. And for me, it's like the light bulb went off, because to pretend that those mills were not paying those people and putting up churches and doing the types of acts that it was doing means that that preacher's preaching was going to be irrelevant, because everybody understands the elephant in the room. But yet to not preach about it, to not talk about it, it starts the sermon off on the path to irrelevancy. But then at the same time, there's the real tension of what happens if I say something about the thing that feeds the people who I serve. And living in that tension is one of the reasons why homiletics has stayed away from conversations about context. Because what Liston Pope talks about in the micro is what's happening from an economic standpoint, from a global standpoint. So as globalization continues to influence and impact our economic choices and our international partnerships and the policies that support the ways in which resources move from the bottom to the top, if we're ignorant to those things, it doesn't make us any more popular with the people who are being affected by these things. So to Tisdale's argument, by paying attention to how the local reality understands itself is critical. But it's also important to take that same framework and then turn it upside down so that we can apply it to the situation that's above us. What does it mean? Who are the wealthiest corporations in the world? What are the organizations that help us to navigate our social political reality? And so my contribution or my invitation is the same invitation that I think Jesus brings about and the same one that I think the writers of the biblical text talk about. One of my favorite passages of scripture is Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. It doesn't have the same snap, crackle, and pop as some of Paul's favorites. It doesn't have the ring of some of the time-tested Psalms. But for me, it speaks to me because it gives me a sense of what my preaching vocation is. Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 says, in the 15th year, in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, ruler of the region of Ituraea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, the ruler of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. In those two verses, Luke stresses the importance of context because good news can only be good news to a context. Because good is a contextual understanding. So if this is good news for the whole world, then there has to be something about this that is going to connect to people, touch people of all realities. So it's important because Luke is telling us that our preaching takes place in a political context. It takes place also in a religious and theological context. Yes, in the micro, in terms of your local church, but in terms of large discussions about theology and religion and the need for religion and the lack of religion and organized religion going down. But the word of God goes to a context that you would not necessarily imagine. It goes to the wilderness, to a guy who's dressed like he deserves to live in the wilderness. And so John the Baptist, in many ways, reflects for us how we are to live in relationship to the ways in which context presses upon us. Because John the Baptist, seemingly unlikely, in a place that from a theological perspective is ripe for theological manifestation and theological testing. But in that place is where God is giving him a message to shape the masses and to move the nations. So there was no YouTube, there was no Zoom for John to stream live from the wilderness. People told people who came out to hear about a person who's preaching in the wilderness about the ways in which God's world is coming to bring down this entire world. So John's preaching is wrapped in his context, but it was wrapped in a context in which he understood who the emperor was. He understood the religious officials because that ended up leading to his beheading. So we want you to keep your heads. Heads are nice to have on your shoulders. They look strange otherwise. But at the same time, John had a sense of conviction about his preaching so that though he was preaching in the wilderness in a context that seemed like people wouldn't listen, people left the cities and came to the wilderness to hear him. So when I meet students who say, man, I'm preaching in this rural context and I don't think people are going to come and I don't know, and I don't want to waste my good years out here in these churches. And I tell people all the time, I said, people come for what they come for. People will drive for what they drive for. People drive from all across the state of Nebraska to go to Lincoln to watch a Cornhusker game. People drive all across Wisconsin to go to Green Bay for a Packers game. Green Bay is 100,000 people. So people will drive and go to the things that compel them. And John the Baptist proves that over and over again. So by us paying attention to our context and letting that inform our proclamation, that's gonna allow us to find the strength to keep us moving in the way that I think we should. So for my colleagues, when we think about preaching in context, we all minister in different spaces. How do you navigate the ways in which you attend to your context from a pastoral standpoint, but you also attend to your context in terms of encouraging them to be the people that they say they want to be? So this, for me, I go and I preach to churches all over wherever I go. So when I ask the rector, when I go to places, I ask the rector, tell me about your church in 2 or 3 sentences. Give me a brief history of your church. What is going on in the life of your church right now? Are there any significant projects happening in the life of your church? And what's happening in your local area? What's hot in your local region? Those things help me to then triangulate what's going on with them. Because I don't know these people. I just get an invitation that says, come to Shadron, Nebraska. Okay, I'm on my way. So I have to then do history on Shadron to understand what it was. I need to then understand, okay, if this church is 100 years old and this church has been here since this town was doing X, Y, and Z, which means its members did this, which means, and so by understanding the history and then how it's located, it helps me then to figure out who's going to be there. So the more information I have, the more I'm able then to almost find a coordinate for where these people might be. Because my preaching doesn't need to, I can't go around preaching like I was their bishop. Where there's 50 churches and you have to kind of do the same spiel everywhere you go. People are inviting me to say something concrete to those people. And so I know that I'm having to do the work of the historical, social, political makeup, what's going on in their congregational life, and then looking at the text and see how that overlays. And by doing that, it helps me to figure out how far I can push the people that I'm working with. Because nobody's ever said we hate people, we want anybody to join. But the actions of some of the churches that I've seen don't always promote the growth that they say. And so my job is to promote. And sometimes that promotion comes from motion that they didn't want me to promote. So yeah, that helps me to kind of think about how to move people. So Dr. Hook, how do you think about shaping and moving and informing this context in terms of making us more aware and more thoughtful?
Yeah, so my preaching context is largely VTS, although I do preach some other places, but I'm very embedded here. And my preaching has changed since I got here, actually. I used to be much more sort of storyteller and much more inclined to use personal stories and so forth. I feel like my preaching since I've gotten here has gotten more theological, more scriptural, which makes sense because this is a community of learning, and I feel that I can do that, and it feeds people in a way. But also, I guess, and also, just practically speaking, I've learned how to preach shorter sermons because where I came from, you could preach a 15-minute sermon, but here at VTS, you can really, in our daily chapel, you can really only do 7, 8, maybe 10 minutes. So pithy, short, and so forth, just because of the structures that we're in, and biblical and theological. But I think the other piece is just and especially now that I'm the dean of students, I'm even more aware of this. it's always been kind of surprising to me in some ways how hard seminary seems for a lot of students, that, and not just academically hard, but kind of spiritually hard and emotionally hard. And I think I underestimated that when I first got here. And I've learned more and more that even though it seems like a pretty comfortable existence in some respects, living in this nice green space and having the nice refectory and having all the stuff, but still on a deeper level, it's a kind of a time of profound disorientation, often disillusionment, confusion, idealism, making contact with reality, and also just often spiritually a time where God can feel somewhat distant. So I have wanted to, I think I have thought in the past that I would preach more sort of political sermons. And in the end, I've done much more pastoral kind of preaching. I'm not sure if that might change in the future because of the larger context that Dr. Jefferson was talking about. But I feel like I have to be fairly tender with folks in this community to some extent. So I think that, I think, what I said about the buildings on campus, I feel that there's a rather traditional ethos to this community, despite our words of welcome and so forth. And we're working with that, but there's that. And so to try to, I think with Tisdale, probably what I do is more sort of stretching, pushing, trying to move people from this sense of comfort with what is to pushing toward something different. But it takes a fairly, I think I generally take a fairly gentle approach, which could be a fault, but that is in keeping with the ethos of this place as being somewhat, I would say, averse to conflict, and being a little bit wanting to emphasize politeness and courtesy and everybody getting along. And so it's just sort of I play into that to some extent, and I push against it to some extent. So that's some of what I would say about how my preaching has adjusted or responds to this context.
As I pass it to Professor Turner, I'll also say that for someone who wants to occupy a role like yours in the future one day, there's an interesting place between being the dean of students who preaches and being the president who preaches. There's an interesting role that, it's almost like being the assistant pastor in a sense, in terms of you're preaching within the scope and mission of something larger than yourself. And so that does provide some interesting structure.
Right.
Go ahead, Anne.
So I preach from the context of parish ministry, of course, and over my career, I've really been I've moved around a bit in 6 different parishes, and the 2 things that I want to highlight that I've been aware of, one is the duration of time I have been there. 4 of those were multi-year places. I think the longest was 7 years, and the way that you work with people in preaching over a longer period of time is very different. And you alluded to this, Mark, than when you're coming in for a brief period of time. So when you're playing the long game, looking for change over an extended period, you're going to notice different things, highlight different things than when you're trying to affect quick change. That being said, the longer you're at a place, the more you identify with it and become a part of it, especially if you've moved to an area to be in a parish, for example. And of course, then you're implicated along with your people in the things you are preaching about. And so that's a very interesting stance to have, being an insider versus being an outsider somewhere. The other thing to lift up is the role that I've been in. Again, I can't remember the number, but some of those places I've been a solo clergy, some of those places I've been in an assisting role. And that allows a different kind of flexibility. And again, you were just alluding to this being part of, Ruthanna being part of a place with a larger mission versus being the one who's setting the mission. And there is a really tremendous opportunity in being something of an outsider, or being in an assisting role, because you can name things that are more difficult to name if you are the one who is setting the course. So on the one hand, you might have less power or less authority potentially, but you have a certain clear-sightedness from being on the margins that's very valuable. I know the classic academic study of religion talks about insider knowledge and outsider knowledge, and your role in relation to a parish can give you those two different kinds of knowledge.
I think to synthesize this and to transition this out, understanding that the context that you're in lives in you as much as you live in the context. And the context is in your consciousness, in your subconsciousness. It's not just a place that you enter into, it is a state of mind. And so to be ignorant of the ways in which we're informed and shaped by these leads us into places where our sermons are then dramatically affected as an utterance of our understanding. So we're inviting you to think deeply and wrestle hard and to utilize the matrix and these other tools to stretch you and to teach you how to stretch so that you can do the things that you need to do to recognize the world so that you can recognize God in the world. Well, thank you for your time, and we hope that you all have a good one, and we'll see you soon.